The ancient religious beliefs of the Britons formed a complex and layered system that had developed over many centuries. In the oldest poetic traditions, fragments of very old ideas appear beside later myths and symbolic interpretations. Stories about a great flood and a surviving ancestral family were remembered in symbolic form, mixed with ritual practices and a growing fascination with the movements of the heavens. Early traditions that may once have reflected simple religious beliefs gradually became intertwined with mythology and celestial symbolism. Figures connected with survival after a great catastrophe were eventually associated with the sun, the moon, and the planets, and these heavenly bodies came to represent sacred ancestors and divine powers. Within this symbolic tradition, the figure of Ceridwen was linked to the idea of a sacred vessel that preserved life through destruction. Over time, she was also connected with the moon, which was seen as her image in the sky. Her companion Tegid was remembered as a patriarchal ancestor, but later, traditions associated him with the distant planet Saturn, and sometimes even with the power of the sun. Another figure, originally connected with the darkness and destruction of the flood, was transformed into a symbol of the returning light. What had once represented catastrophe eventually became a story of renewal, expressed through the rebirth of the sun and the restoration of order. Because of these beliefs, sacred places were designed to reflect both the earthly stories of survival and the patterns observed in the sky. The sanctuaries connected with these traditions were not simply places of ritual gathering. They were intended to represent a larger cosmic order. Ritual language itself was sometimes imagined as a sacred presence, a symbolic voice that carried religious teaching and ceremonial law. This symbolic voice represented the traditions and teachings of the Druids, preserved and transmitted in ritual centres dedicated to the sacred myths. One of the most important names connected with these sanctuaries was Caer Sidi, a term that referred to a sacred enclosure. The chief religious authority associated with such a sanctuary was believed to speak from a symbolic seat of authority, and the teachings delivered from that place were considered sacred knowledge. The sanctuary itself was understood as a centre where tradition, ritual, and cosmic symbolism came together. The name Caer Sidi became closely tied to the religious identity of these ritual centres, and its meaning extended far beyond a simple physical location. According to old poetic traditions, the original model for such a sanctuary was believed to have been a sacred vessel in which a heroic figure and his companions escaped a great flood. This vessel was remembered as a place of safety and renewal, and later sanctuaries were thought to reflect its form and meaning. The idea of a protected space surrounded by dangerous waters became an important symbolic image. Within this protected centre there was security and abundance, even while destruction raged outside. These themes appeared not only in stories but also in ritual traditions that preserved the memory of survival and restoration. As religious symbolism developed further, the same sacred name came to be applied to the great circle of the sky. The path along which the sun, moon, and planets appeared to move was imagined as a vast enclosure surrounding the world. This celestial circle became another expression of the same sacred idea that had once been connected with the vessel of survival. The turning of the heavens provided a powerful image of continuity and renewal, and this cosmic circle came to share the same sacred name as the ritual sanctuaries on Earth. The language itself reflected this idea of circular movement and enclosure. The sacred name suggested a place defined by a boundary and marked by continual motion. The concept could describe the vessel that carried the survivors of a great disaster, the circle of the heavens through which the stars moved, or the sanctuaries where rituals were performed. Mythology united these meanings into a single symbolic system in which earthly structures mirrored cosmic order. Descriptions preserved in early poetic traditions portray the sanctuary as a protected centre surrounded by flowing waters and open to the life-giving power that descended from above. These images closely resemble the story of a vessel, preserved in the midst of a great flood. The sanctuary was imagined as a place where safety, stability, and nourishment existed despite the forces of destruction outside. Such imagery suggests that ritual practices preserved the memory of ancient stories about survival through catastrophe. The same traditions also connected the sanctuary with the movements of the heavens. The circular path of the stars was imagined as constantly turning through the elements of the universe. The sun stood at the center of this cosmic order, and religious leaders sometimes described their own authority in symbolic language that reflected the power of the sun. Their role was understood as representing the divine order on earth, acting as intermediaries between the visible world and the unseen forces believed to govern it. Questions have long existed about the physical form of these sanctuaries. Some may have been simple natural places such as caves, forest clearings, or small islands surrounded by water. Others appear to have been carefully constructed circular enclosures made of earth or stone. Many surviving monuments in Britain consist of rings of standing stones or circular banks and ditches, and these structures may reflect the same symbolic ideas described in the old traditions. Their circular design suggests a deliberate attempt to imitate the cosmic patterns believed to govern the universe. The symbolism behind these structures centered on two great themes: the sacred ancestors who survived destruction, and the vessel that preserved them. Over time, these figures were represented by the sun and the moon, which were seen as the most powerful lights in the sky. Similar connections between ancestral figures and celestial bodies appear in many ancient cultures, suggesting a widespread attempt to link human origins with the visible order of the heavens. Ancient artistic designs from the Mediterranean world illustrate comparable ideas. Mythological figures connected with fertility and renewal were sometimes shown travelling in vehicles, shaped like boats or crescents, surrounded by symbols representing the changing seasons. The 12 divisions of the year were often marked by symbolic figures arranged in a circular pattern, emphasizing the connection between mythology and the regular cycles of nature. Such imagery reflects the same belief that religious stories and celestial observation formed parts of a single unified system. If a sacred space were designed to reflect these ideas, the central area would contain symbolic representations of the divine powers, while markers arranged in a surrounding circle would represent the constellations and the passing seasons. Among peoples who avoided elaborate buildings or carved statues, these symbols could take the form of rough stones or wooden posts placed in circular arrangements. The stone circles that still survive in parts of Britain may represent such attempts to express cosmic order in physical form. The circular shape of these sanctuaries is suggested not only by surviving monuments, but also by the language used in early traditions. Words meaning circle or enclosure appear repeatedly in descriptions of sacred places, reinforcing the idea that these sites were intended to represent the structure of the world itself. The stones that formed these circles were remembered in early traditions as important elements of the sacred landscape, marking places where ritual gatherings took place. One well-known example stood in a mountainous region near the western coast, where early descriptions mention a circular enclosure surrounded by upright stones. The site occupied an open area on high ground and was visible from a distance. Some of the stones were tall and imposing, while others were smaller but carefully arranged. Nearby were additional standing stones set in geometric patterns, along with stone-built chambers and burial mounds. The entire landscape formed a connected ritual complex that reflected long-standing religious traditions. Hyrule open respect for the sacred rites he had personally undergone makes it unlikely that he would speak carelessly about the shrine tied to those traditions. His position and education would have given him access to local knowledge if deeper investigation had ever been needed. But in this case, the meaning of the place was not difficult to grasp. A sanctuary still used by a living tradition does not require guesswork to explain it. For generations, ceremonial poets and ritual specialists had preserved a continuous chain of practice and memory, reaching back to the age when Druidic religion still shaped public life. Seen in that light, the stone monument in the Gavilchi region can be read as more than an isolated ring of pillars. In the period Hyle described, sanctuaries linked to the older mysteries were commonly understood as earthly counterparts to a larger celestial pattern. Their names, their layouts, and even their ritual language implied that they were images of the great turning circle in the sky. In other words, these sites were treated as models of the zodiac or as structures designed to mirror events believed to unfold within that heavenly band, such as the cycle of seasons, the rising and setting points of key lights, and the repeating order by which time was measured. The most striking detail in the Gavilchi monument is the circle of 12 stones. The number is difficult to dismiss as accidental in a culture that consistently attached meaning to repeating counts and recurring cycles. 12 naturally suggests a division of time, a ring of stations, a sequence that returns again and again. In many ancient systems, 12 marks a full sweep of seasonal change, a complete circuit that resets the world. The Gavilchi circle, described as having upright stones around its outer edge, fits that symbolic logic. A sanctuary built to represent the turning year would not only be circular, but would also be organised in a count that matched the calendar of the sky. Even when the surviving description is incomplete, it still points toward a familiar type of monument, found across Britain. Similar stone circles appear in widely separated landscapes, from southern plains to northern coasts, and they share the same basic language of design. A ring, a measured diameter, upright stones placed as markers, and sometimes additional stones set apart with deliberate geometry. Antiquaries have long argued that many of these circles were not built at random. Some appear to follow astronomical alignments, while others seem designed to embody calculations and repeating periods used to track time. The recurrence of certain numbers in these monuments has fueled the idea that they carried a practical function as well as a ritual one. 12 appears often, but so do other counts associated with longer cycles, including 19, 30, and 60. These numbers can be linked to different ways of reconciling lunar and solar rhythms, or to methods of counting ceremonial generations, or to traditional systems of reckoning time in large, repeating blocks. The Gavilchi sanctuary itself was never meant to rival the monumental scale of the most famous rings on the island. It was a regional site, not the centerpiece of a national landscape. Yet even a provincial sanctuary can preserve the same symbolic grammar found in grander monuments. The repetition of 12 in much larger complexes suggests that the number carried a recognized meaning, shared across regions. Other sites also show arrangements that echo the Gavilchi pattern, including a triangular grouping of stones set apart from the main ring. Such a feature appears again and again, as if builders wanted a secondary marker for a specific direction, a ritual focus, or a key event in the cycle of light. From this smaller sanctuary, attention naturally shifts toward the larger rings that dominated collective imagination. Stonehenge, above all, stands as the monument most often treated as a high temple of the old religion. Its design has repeatedly been interpreted as evidence of skilled observation and careful planning. The structure is circular, its interior spaces are organised with a sense of hierarchy, and its approach routes emphasise specific directions. Interpreters have argued that the site's entrances and axes point toward meaningful sunrise positions, and that its counts and sequences reflect a concern with major time cycles. Whether every proposed calculation is correct is a separate question, but the broader point remains. The monument clearly embodies intentional geometry and a consistent symbolic plan. Saw divine power expressed through the saw, divine power expressed through the heavens. An open sanctuary makes a certain kind of sense. It allows the sky to remain present as the ceiling of worship, and it turns the movement of light into part of the ceremony itself. Archaeological discoveries reported at such sites, including animal remains, have been used to argue for sacrificial feasting within or near the sacred boundary. Even allowing for uncertainty in interpretation, the idea that large gatherings occurred there is not difficult to imagine, given the size, visibility, and formal organisation of the place. Yet a different kind of evidence matters just as much as architectural theory. Memory, story, and the way later generations spoke about the monument. A dramatic and widely remembered act of violence connected Stonehenge to national history in a way few sites could match. The event described in early accounts is not a battlefield defeat, but a planned killing carried out under the disguise of peace. According to the narrative, a Saxon leader proposed a meeting meant to settle tensions and confirm an alliance. The invitation promised safety and required that both parties come without weapons, a gesture meant to remove suspicion. The chosen location was Stonehenge, a place already loaded with authority and symbolic weight, and the meeting was scheduled for a season associated with renewal and public assemblies. Behind the scenes, the Saxon leader is said to have prepared an ambush. His followers were instructed to conceal knives and wait for a signal. The Britons, trusting the arrangement, arrived unarmed and were seated in alternating order among their guests, a layout that looked like a display of confidence but functioned as a trap. At the height of the feast, the signal was given. In an instant, the hidden blades appeared and the Britons were struck down where they sat. The number of victims in the tradition is large, described as the flower of the nobility. Men known for leadership in council and war. One figure is said to have been spared, not out of mercy but for leverage, to force concessions afterward. Alongside this main story, another strand survives. The account of a British survivor who escaped the slaughter and fought back with whatever could be seized in the moment. Later tradition gives him different titles, as if memory struggled to place him neatly within a single category. Some sources treat him as a prince, others as a churchman, and some later writers split the identity into two brothers to explain the overlap. The simpler explanation is that one prominent figure carried both political and religious authority, which was not unusual in eras when leadership and sacred roles could merge. In the aftermath, stories of vengeance, burials, and the raising of memorials attach themselves to this same person, and in some versions he becomes closely linked with the rise of a new leader who takes power during the crisis that followed. For poets of the 6th century, such an event could not remain unspoken. The massacre was the kind of catastrophe that demanded lament, and the surviving poetry repeatedly circles around the same image. A feast turning into slaughter, a gathering arranged as if for friendship becoming a scene of sudden death. In one poem, the focus falls on the sanctuary itself. The language depicts a sacred circle where authority is exercised, and ritual drink is served, a place of order and ceremony that is violated by treachery. The plot is painted with sharp contrasts: formal hospitality against hidden intent, celebratory music against the sudden sound of violence, trust against calculated betrayal. The poem does not read like a calm record. It moves like grief, shifting from praise into rage and from ritual language into the imagery of waves, storms, and blades. In this poetic memory, the leader associated with the sanctuary appears as a presiding figure, someone connected with ceremony and also with protection. The feast is described as a deliberate arrangement, equal numbers invited, drink distributed, and a conference staged as if it were a lawful assembly. Then, the entire scene collapses into killing. A bardic voice is described as the first victim, a resident singer tied to the sanctuary, struck down before the wider slaughter unfolds. That detail matters, because it frames the violence not only as political murder, but as an assault on sacred order, aimed first at the voice that carried ritual authority. The sanctuary is not merely a backdrop, it is part of the meaning. A holy precinct turned into a trap. Geography reinforces the impression. The feast is placed not inside a closed building, but within a defined open area near the temple. A long, bounded space in the landscape, marked by ditches and measured breadth, has been interpreted as part of the ceremonial approach to the main ring. If temporary structures were raised there for a great gathering, the setting would match the story's logic. An assembly held in the shadow of the most imposing sanctuary, close enough to borrow its authority, but arranged in a space suited for large numbers. The poetry also preserves how the monument was perceived. It is called a great circle, a great sanctuary, not simply a heap of stones. The wording suggests prerogative and central status, as if the site still carried the rank of a national temple in the era when the massacre occurred. That may feel surprising to later eyes, but it fits an age when conversion to new faiths was incomplete and older practices remained embedded in local identity. Religious life in such periods often shows overlap rather than clean replacement. Older rites persist at the edges. Older sanctuaries remain meaningful, and public belief becomes a mixture of inherited custom and new language. A second major poetic witness offers an even larger canvas. The work, commonly known as the Gododdin, survives as a series of intense songs, rather than a single continuous narrative. The voice behind it belongs to a bard who lived in the late 5th and 6th centuries. The surviving text is difficult, shaped by archaic spelling, regional dialect, damaged transmission, and the habit of describing people through epithets rather than names. The songs often assume that the audience already knows the individuals and events, which makes later interpretation difficult. Over centuries of copying, the text accumulated broken lines and fragmentary passages that no longer carry clear sense, and many parts exist in multiple variant readings. Even so, certain themes remain unmistakable. Again and again, the songs return to a central horror. Not warriors falling in open battle, but nobles slaughtered without weapons in a moment of supposed peace, seated among armed enemies at a feast. The number given is strikingly consistent with the massacre tradition. The details also match: the mixed seating arrangement, the sudden signal, the shift from celebration to bloodshed. The bard speaks as someone who witnessed the catastrophe, yet the songs appear to have been composed years later, during a time of hardship, possibly in captivity. That distance explains why the event is treated both as memory and as wound, revisited repeatedly in separate songs as if the mind cannot leave it behind. The songs avoid direct naming in many places, and that avoidance can be explained without forcing it into mystery. A poet composing under the shadow of enemies would have reason to choose insinuation over accusation. Epithets allow anger to be expressed while maintaining a layer of protection. They also sharpen the poetry's bite. A traitor can be painted as a predator, a plotter as a wolf, a killer as a storm, without needing a formal identification. The audience in the poet's own time would have understood the targets, while later readers inherit the riddle. The internal logic of the songs also suggests that the feast catastrophe occurred decades before composition. The bard appeals to the testimony of earlier authorities, to the remembered words of older poets, and to establish songs already associated with the event. He gestures toward later political consequences and shifting leadership after the slaughter. That kind of backward glance fits an older man speaking about the disaster of his youth, turning it into a set of songs meant to preserve the truth when open speech is dangerous. When the timing is adjusted for that interval, the catastrophe lands naturally within the era of the famous Stonehenge massacre tradition. No other event preserved in British or Saxon memory aligns so closely with the core elements repeated in the songs. The feast, the treachery, the unarmed nobles, the scale of the killing, the presence of a major sanctuary, and the long shadow it cast over subsequent years all converge on the same historical anchor. The poetry does not read like a detached chronicle, but it does preserve a consistent shape of memory, and that shape matches the story attached to Stonehenge more closely than any other surviving episode. Gododdin can describe a northern region in early sources, yet in the poem it also seems to mean the very site where the nobles gathered, drank, and died. That double use looks confusing at first, but it may reflect careful wording rather than simple inconsistency. The name itself can be understood in more than one way. It can describe a district partly shielded by a defensive barrier, and it can also describe an open sanctuary, ringed by an earthwork or bank, roofless above, protected around. In a world where sacred circles and fortified boundaries shared the same visual logic, a single term could slide between landscape and shrine without breaking the listener's understanding. Ambiguity could even be useful, allowing a poet to point toward a place while keeping language just indirect enough to avoid danger. A similar issue surrounds Cattraeth. It resembles the name of a known town in the north of England, but the poem's use does not require a northern town at all. In this tradition, names often carry symbolic meanings drawn from religious language. Cattraeth can function less like a map label and more like a title for the great ritual enclosure itself, the place where authority was proclaimed and formal speech was delivered from a presiding seat. In that sense, it becomes a poetic shorthand for the sanctuary and its ceremonial precinct, not a fixed settlement. The poem's own patterns support this reading. The assembly at Cattraeth is described like a ritual gathering, a planned feast, a managed seating arrangement, and an ambush executed within a sacred legal framework. That scene fits a major ceremonial site far better than it fits a random battlefield town. Working through this kind of text requires more than a quick translation. The language is old, compressed, and often damaged by centuries of copying. Many lines survive in variant forms, and proper names are frequently replaced by sharp epithets that would have been obvious to a contemporary audience, but feel cryptic now. The surviving work also reads less like one single poem and more like a chain of short songs that return again and again to the same central wound. The voice shifts, the focus tightens, then pulls back as if the poet is revisiting the memory in fragments. Each song another attempt to say what happened without giving enemies an easy handle for punishment. Across these songs, one core picture repeats with relentless clarity. This was not a normal battle where armed men fell in open combat. It was the killing of unarmed nobles during a supposed peace meeting at a feast where guests were arranged side by side with armed opponents. The moment turns on a signal, a sudden movement, and a pre-planned strike executed at the tables. Even when the poem speaks in metaphor, wolves, sea rovers, storms, ravens, it keeps returning to the same mechanics of betrayal. The guests arrive confident, expecting agreement. The attackers arrive prepared, carrying hidden blades. The feast becomes the trap. In the earliest songs, the poet pauses over a young bard or companion, someone associated with peacemaking and ceremonial order, cut down before the spear is even raised. The language paints the cruelty in a bitter sequence. The floor stained with blood before the feast truly begins. The raven fed before a proper fight can even happen. It is not just grief for a friend. It is an accusation that the rules of hospitality and sanctuary were deliberately profaned. This opening loss sets the tone for everything that follows. The poem is not simply mourning dead warriors, it is mourning the collapse of trust itself. Then the portraits widen. A leader appears again and again behind the violence, a sea-born chief, decorated and conspicuous, presented as both diplomatic and predatory. He proposes conditions designed to disarm suspicion: no weapons, no shields, claiming the restriction will prevent quarrels and keep the gathering safe. The poem treats this as a performance, a staged reassurance. Beneath it, the attackers are already organised. The signal is agreed upon. The knives are ready. When the moment comes, the strike is described as quick, intimate, and systematic, each killer turning on the person beside him. The poem's repeated emphasis on the lack of shields and spears is not decorative. It is the moral core of the charge. The next layer of blame is even darker. The poem implies that the trap was enabled by internal politics. A British ruler returned to power after earlier disgrace is framed as the one who opened the door and made the selection. The feast becomes a political purge as much as a foreign ambush, an opportunity to remove influential nobles who had fought under a rival leader and who might still challenge authority. That is why the poem keeps describing the dead, not as ordinary warriors, but as the strongest counsellors and fighters of the land. Men whose absence would cripple resistance. Treachery is not limited to the attacker. It is presented as a network. The songs also preserve small details that make the scene feel staged, like a ceremony. Torchlight, rich cloth, deliberate displays of wealth, formal serving of drink, chosen attendants, even the arrangement of transport for a convenient escape. All of it reads like a public occasion designed to project confidence and unity. The poet's bitterness comes from the contrast: golden cups and polished ritual language, followed by the most brutal kind of close-range killing. The peace meeting becomes a mask that makes the crime more complete. At the centre of the aftermath stands another figure, the governor of the feast, a powerful leader tied to ritual authority and public order. In the poem, he is not simply a warrior. He is someone positioned at the threshold between ceremony and violence. When the massacre begins, he is described extending a long spear across the dividing line, as if trying to halt the rush or create a barrier. Around him, the scene turns into fire and confusion. Temporary structures burning, smoke rising, crowds surging, the attackers thrown off balance. The image is chaotic but precise. A sudden uprising against men armed mainly with short blades, disoriented by flames and resistance. The poem presents this response as the first moment when the attacker's certainty breaks. From there, the songs move into retaliation and pursuit. Ravens and eagles appear in the imagery, not as decoration but as a grim measure of battlefields after the feast. The leader who survives the initial shock becomes the driver of counter-violence, pushing the attackers back, scattering them, then hunting them again later. Names remain elusive, and the poem often refuses to be explicit, but the pattern is clear. The feast is only the first act. What follows is a chain of campaigns, reprisals, and power shifts that reshape the land. The poem hints at captured chiefs, forced withdrawals, and territories contested at the margins of northern and western frontiers. Interwoven with the massacre songs are laments for an earlier British champion who had once driven the Saxons away, only to die through poisoning and court intrigue. That elegy sits beside the feast narrative like a warning. The nation lost its defender, then lost its nobility, and the gap was filled by men skilled at manipulation, offering friendly cups that concealed death, speaking peace while preparing knives. In the poet's memory, the cup becomes a recurring symbol, intoxicating drink as celebration, drink as deception, drink as a tool for murder. The strongest documentary thread comes from how consistently these songs describe one specific kind of catastrophe, a mass killing at a feast, carried out through a signal against unarmed nobles in or near a sacred enclosure, followed by desperate defence and fire. When that pattern is compared against what is otherwise remembered in British tradition, only one episode fits with real force: the notorious massacre associated with Stonehenge. The poem's ambiguity in placed names then looks less like confusion and more like strategy. Language that can be heard two ways, protecting the speaker while preserving the truth for those who know the story. Caradog's name survives in the old memory as something steady and reassuring. He is pictured as a man who knows his place in the world and keeps it safe, not through arrogance, but through discipline. Before the moment of danger, he moves with calm restraint, gentle in manner and careful in speech. Yet when conflict becomes unavoidable, he does not lose himself in fury. He fights with clear judgment, brave without being reckless, measured without being weak. In the tradition that preserves him, this balance is part of his honour, a protector who can be peaceful when peace is possible, and formidable when it is not. The hope expressed for him is not the reward of conquest, but the simple idea that a guardian who served well might find his way home beyond this life. In the scenes that follow, he appears leading through chaos with a shield that catches the light, organising the camp and holding a position that others might have abandoned. Spears splinter as they strike, and blades bite deep. The fighting is described as close, exhausting, and unforgiving. Still, he remains where he is needed. His duty is not only to advance, but to keep a particular point from collapsing, to prevent panic from turning order into stampede. Even when the story turns toward his fall, the emphasis stays on what he completed before he went down. He kept the station. He held the line until the moment could no longer be held. That is why his name is spoken with admiration rather than pity. Caradog is remembered in a different register, as if the language itself becomes louder when he enters. When he surges forward, the comparison is not to a careful defender, but to a force of nature. A boar breaking through brush, a bull at the centre of the herd. The picture is not subtle. He cuts into the press, opens space with sheer momentum, and draws others into motion by a gesture that signals where the violence will concentrate. Witnesses are invoked not as footnotes, but as a way of saying that this was not an invention of later storytellers. People once swore they saw it, and their words passed along. Caradog survives hard fighting in more than one place and returns from brutal encounters that should have taken him, yet the tradition insists on the bitter irony that courage in battle does not protect a man from the cup offered in false friendship. After the clear drink is placed in his hand at the fatal gathering, he does not return to his father again. The old songs linger on that contrast. The warrior who escaped steel on open ground is undone in a hall meant for peace. From there, the narrative widens to a roll of men whose names are spoken like a tolling bell. They arrive together, confident and united, the sort of company a country leans on when times turn harsh. They are described as men proven in earlier trials, riders used to hard dawns, fighters who had carried their weight when the day demanded it. But at the feast, the price is paid in lives. One by one, the list is given. Caradog and Madoc, Pil and Iwan, Peredur with iron strength, Gaudur and Aedan, who once escaped the crush with a battered shield. The tradition does not pretend they were flawless, and it does not romanticize their last moments. It says simply that none of them returned to ordinary life. They had struck down enemies before, and they themselves were struck down. The turning point is not that they were outmatched in fair combat. It is that they were taken where no one expects the rules of hospitality to be broken. The account of that year is heavy with condemnation. The gathering is remembered as a shared table and a shared drink, yet also as an engineered trap prepared by designers who planned the scene in advance. The result is described as a sickness that spreads into the land, grief that does not fade, resentment that outlasts funerals, and a kind of shame that follows a community that allowed such a meeting to happen. The text paints the dead not as strangers, but as men who should have been protected by their own society. Their end is described as a stain in a place that should have been clean, a flaw that drinks in blood where songs once carried. The cause is traced back to two forces moving together: the chosen drink offered by a ruler who hosted the feast, and the rage left behind by a decisive victory in an earlier battle. The implication is clear. The killers were not acting in sudden passion. They were settling accounts. That earlier battle is then recalled in vivid detail, as if the narrator wants to prove the worth of the dead before describing their betrayal. The warriors who later fall at the feast are shown in their true element: mounted strength, red armour, shields lifted, spears upright, sharp lances glittering mail, swords that do not hesitate. The story insists they were not weak men who wandered into danger for sport. They had broken through enemy ranks, dropped whole formations, and forced the fight to turn. They had also honoured the sacred order of their world by giving gifts at the altar and rewarding the singers who carried fame forward. Their deaths at the banquet are framed as a theft from the entire community, because the men who fell were the ones who had held the enemy back. When the narrative turns to the great sanctuary and its precinct, the tone becomes almost architectural, as if describing something meant to endure. The place is presented as powerful, carefully formed, and not built as an arena for brawling. It is a site of ceremony, order, and the controlled fire that stands for continuity. Yet violence erupts there anyway. The first open outrage is remembered as the killing of a chief singer, someone whose role was to keep memory and lore alive through voice. The attacker is described as armed and hardened, carrying a piercing weapon, more like a predator than a guest. The blow that ends the singer's life lands at the stone boundary of the shared sanctuary, and the story marks that moment as a point of no return. It is not merely a murder, it is a public violation of the place itself. Then the defender appears, called by many titles in the old songs, but always recognisable by action. He does not sit idle. He does not hesitate. He turns the sanctuary into a position to be held, not a symbol to be mourned. The tradition describes a counterstroke that is fast and punishing, a spear point driving through painted corselets, forcing horses into flight, breaking the attacker's order before it can fully harden. Fire becomes part of the defence. Temporary structures and outer areas fill with smoke. Those who came expecting easy plunder are pushed back through heat and confusion, and the story dwells on the panic of a retreat that suddenly becomes necessary. The attackers are mocked as men who did not earn their drink, slaves to a host they flatter. Now discovering that the ground they violated does not belong to them. The next movement is retaliation beyond the feast itself. A battle is recalled where the fleeing host is struck hard, shields dragging, formations broken, the retreat turned into a rout. The image used is not delicate. A roaring force, like a herd driven forward by a leader who fights as a symbol of the community's rage. The enemy's hope is crushed not only by swords, but by the refusal to grant them the mercy they denied at the tables. A message comes from the defeated side, carried by an elder counsellor marked with the sign of a prancing horse, an offer, a plea, a request for protection. The response is not negotiation. The refusal bursts out like a shout, shaped by memory of the earlier deception. The old story treats this moment as justice rather than cruelty. The demand is that the plotter should receive the same kind of kindness he showed when he signalled for stabbing. The narrative returns again to the first victim, the learned singer whose death ignited the defence. His killing is mourned as the piercing of a skilled mind, the cutting down of a melodious voice that should have been protected by the rules of Sanctuary. In response, the defender's spear is described turning into a shield for the sacred place, a visible barrier raised in anger and duty. The tradition also remembers that the cycle of betrayal had already poisoned the land through court intrigue and treacherous gifts, and it folds that into the same moral lesson. A smiling invitation can hide a knife. A bright cup can carry death. The treacherous figure associated with that pattern is said to perish as an expiation, not because vengeance is sweet, but because the story demands that betrayal should not be left unanswered. Afterward, the surviving material becomes uneven. Fragments, damaged lines, partial scenes. Even so, the outline remains visible. There are disputes about decisions made in desperate moments, arguments over whether a city should have been entered, whether riches should have been seized, whether orders were clear at dawn. The voice of the narrator shifts into something more personal, not proud, not theatrical, but tired. He refuses to rage at mockery, refuses to perform bitterness for applause. Instead, he places himself in a grim setting, chained, injured, confined in a dark underground place, composing short pieces in the hours before morning. The songs become a way to survive, a way to keep hold of memory when everything else has been taken. The narrator presents this not as heroism but as necessity, a mind refusing to go silent. Then the story opens again, showing that time has passed and the narrator has been freed by a generous lord from the north, a man praised for courage and restraint. Gratitude is offered plainly. The liberator is described as someone who would not have tolerated the disgrace of a sacred meeting being turned into a slaughter, someone who would have provided weapons if violence was inevitable, and who would have defended guests with his own arm, rather than trusting an enemy's promises. This contrast is deliberate. It shows what honourable leadership looks like, so the earlier betrayal appears even more disgraceful. The account of the feast returns with sharper detail. Booths and horses, prepared space and hidden knives, blood and armour, the long blade ready to thrust, everything arranged before the guests understand what is happening. The seating is described as alternating, an armed man beside an unarmed man, a deliberate pattern disguised as friendliness. The story stresses that the victims were not cowards. They were men who had defended many places in many fights. They were lured not by weakness, but by trust in a public compact. That trust is what was exploited, and the result is said to be total. The whole assembly pierced through, the best support of the land removed in one engineered moment. Even the bitter dialogue that survives from these traditions keeps the same moral centre. The treacherous alliance is ridiculed. The paramour's promises are treated as poison. The trapped ruler is mocked for the consequences of his choices, and the invader's hunger is described in blunt, animal terms. The point is not comedy, but disgust. The story refuses to let betrayal pretend it was strategy without shame. With a shield slung high on his shoulder, he moved through the aftermath like a man pouring victory and vengeance from a clear vessel. The old voice insists on the contrast. Bloodshed, released as freely as wine, yet treated by the killers as a kind of payment they demanded. Those who once squeezed silver from a hall of drink were forced to return gold in exchange, not as generosity, but as the cost of what they had unleashed. In that reversal, a grim idea takes shape. The banquet that began as a show of power ends as a reckoning, and the men who thought they could buy safety with ceremony discover that the debt is collected in a harsher currency. The story turns again and again toward the same obligation, to keep the names of the defenders alive. It frames remembrance as duty, not entertainment. After the first shocking blow, the surviving champions are described as a renewed current, as if courage itself had to be refilled when the land was suddenly drained. Their hands are shown feeding the scavenging birds and the prowling beasts. Images meant to say that battle left nothing untouched, and that the price of betrayal was counted in bodies. Yet the point is not to glorify cruelty. It is to underline consequence. Treachery did not end the struggle. It widened it, drew new fighters into the storm, and forced the betrayed to answer violence with violence simply to remain standing. Among those who rode toward the fatal gathering, many wore gold chains, marks of rank and trust, and they came because a mountain ruler summoned them. The tradition does not pretend that help arrived from every horizon. It stresses something sharper. No distant saviour appeared at the last moment. The strongest protection came from within the same world that was being attacked, from a leader whose name becomes a measure of worth. Again and again, the narrative returns to the claim that no better champion stood for the Britons in that crisis, and that his value was proved not by speeches, but by what he held and defended, when the hall turned into a killing ground. Then the language shifts into mythic scale, not to preach religion, but to show how the people of that age imagined their sanctuary. The temple is portrayed as a world in miniature, a circle that represented order, memory, and sacred continuity. In that vision, the chosen priest was not simply a warrior with a title, but the appointed guardian of the circle, the man fitted to stand between a holy enclosure and a force that wanted to strip it bare. The tradition emphasizes the bitter outcome. Despite the wealth, despite the horses, despite the confidence of the gathering, almost no one returned. One dignified survivor stands out, the presiding defender linked to the structure itself, and the loneliness of that return becomes part of the tragedy. It is not a tale of a narrow defeat. It is a tale of near total loss. The blame, however, does not fall only on outsiders. The account repeatedly names an internal hand that arranged the seating, selected the unarmed, and dressed certain men in fine display as if they were guests of honour rather than targets. The act is remembered as cold planning disguised as hospitality, and the memory of it burns through the entire narrative. The meeting takes place in early May, at a season of solemn rites beside a purifying fire meant to represent renewal. The tradition lingers on the rhythm of a full ritual week. Dark garments worn, then bright clothing cleansed, duties performed day by day, victims led around the circle, processions repeating their path, and the order of ceremony unfolding as if nothing could break it. That detail matters because it makes the collapse more shocking. The same circle that promised protection ends up witnessing a flood of violence so overwhelming it is described as rising to the belt. After the rites and the toil, a report spreads from camp to camp. Only a fraction survived. The number changes from passage to passage because these are songs and memories, not ledgers, but the message stays consistent. The gathering did not end with a fair contest. It ended with slaughter. The narrative's insistence is simple and relentless. A proud assembly was reduced to almost nothing, and grief did not fade because the dead were not strangers. They were the visible strength of their world. When the focus tightens on the moment of crisis, the scene shifts to an early morning tumult at a gate near the ceremonial course. Something breaks open. Fire appears suddenly, not as decoration, but as a barrier. The defender is described like a boar guarding a treasure mound, forcing an enemy to confront heat and confusion before reaching the heart of the sanctuary. The ground stains dark, and the imagery of hunting birds returns, suggesting raiders and predators circling the prize. This is not presented as a heroic fantasy where one man saves the day with ease. It reads like desperate improvisation. Kindle the passage, block the entrance, gather allies in formation, and push forward before panic becomes defeat. A speech is placed into the defender's mouth, and it explains the moral core of the tale in plain terms. The attackers are accused of turning shared merriment into butchery, of striking down an unarmed singer, of violating an older privilege that protected a ceremonial messenger. The story treats the branch the singer carried as a symbol of restraint, a sign meant to quiet conflict before it ignited. The claim is that the songs were not entertainment, but an instrument of peace, a recognized method for calming armed men before battle. In that worldview, killing the singer while he bore that symbol was not merely murder. It was an assault on the rule that kept society from tearing itself apart in an instant. From there, the account moves quickly into action. The defender, usually described as calm, is shown crossing a line. Outrage forces him into war, and his allies follow, refusing to scatter. They fight as if survival depends on discipline, because it does. Trappings and horses are called for. Bands are tied around temples, and the imagery turns harsh. The image of death becomes the role forced upon a man who would have preferred order. Spears are set, shrubs are lit like torches to provide light in the confusion. And the musical tribe, the men of ritual and song, are shown fighting with whatever they can grasp. The point is not that they loved battle. The point is that the sanctuary and its traditions have been struck, and there is no choice but to answer. The story widens again, describing vengeance that reaches beyond the first attackers and falls upon the local architect of ruin as well. This figure is painted as talented and capable, even charming at feasts, yet empty of loyalty to his own land. His punishment is described not as a private assassination, but as a public collapse, a stronghold consumed and a ruler swallowed by smoke and flame. The tradition speaks as if justice had finally caught up with a man who treated the country as a tool for his own security. Yet even here, the narration remains more judgment than celebration. The land does not suddenly heal. Victory does not erase the earlier wound. After that, the songs speak in the voice of alarm. War spreads to coasts and borders. Spears rise against former allies. Blades hack in wild uproar. A prosperous leader stands in front, carrying a banner marked with a horse, turning a symbol once used for deception into a sign, recognized on the battlefield. Fire burns before him and will not be blown aside. Commands are given. A guarded front line is arranged. The leader descends upon scattered enemies, taking the weight of the clash when the cry goes up. The account insists that some of the defenseless are saved only because his arm shields them. It returns again to the cruel detail of the feast. Shields were excluded under a false excuse, a so-called need for light and open space, while the raiders kept their own protection. And in the middle of that trap, the defender appears in a strange ritual posture, seated on a grey horse as if holding a ceremonial office even while death begins to fall. The songs preserve the absurdity because it reveals the shock. The world was still pretending to be orderly at the exact moment it became lawless. A final image is repeated like a stamp. A high viewpoint above a river and a ceremonial fire below. a procession moving as if the old rites still held power. Then disorder breaks loose, and the next sight is a shout rising with a severed head carried aloft. The language is brutal, but its purpose is clear. It marks the end of the chief plotter and announces that the betrayal was answered in a way that could not be ignored. The songs do not treat this as clean justice that restores peace. They treat it as the hard settlement of a crime that shattered the rules of meeting, song, and sanctuary. In the aftermath, the narrative describes the removal of enemy bones, banners raised, ships driven back toward the sea. The victorious leader is pictured pushing outward, ordering a descent before the enemy can regroup, refusing to let the conflict return to the same doorstep. Yet another shadow hangs over the tale. The leader who should have died in open battle is said to fall later by deceit, undone not by an equal blade, but by a pale drink offered under a false role. The story uses that detail to remind the listener that treachery did not vanish with one execution. It remained a weapon in the hands of those who could not win by strength. From there, the voice becomes more reflective and mournful. It looks back across years of struggle and admits a bitter truth. After all the labour, the land still suffers for mistakes, for divided loyalties, and for the decision to share a feast with men who had already shown their nature. Great names are listed as if the narrator is trying to keep them from slipping away, and each name carries the weight of a vanished generation. A previous leader is praised for planning, for logistics, for refusing to let cowards stall the line, for gathering supplies, weapons, and messengers before the crisis arrived. But the same sentence turns, because planning did not save the banquet. Strength did not prevent the trap. After the intoxication, there was no full deliverance, and the enemy never truly left again. Other figures enter the later landscape, commanders of fleets, men who raised signals on shields, leaders whose fame ran ahead to harbours where anchors were lifted in a rush. The songs describe swift movements, ships departing like birds released, warriors eager and bright with purpose. Even here, the banquet returns as a haunting image, the generous bowl, the large vessel, the easy confidence of men who believed fellowship could hold. The tradition cannot stop circling back to that moment, because it sees it as the hinge of the age, the place where the old protections failed. Finally, the narrative turns to an elegy for the ruler, whose choices helped open the door to catastrophe. He is described retreating into wild country, clinging to horses and arms, believing it fortunate merely to be left alone. Yet warnings come to him from a man of song, and the attack arrives soon after, carried out by those who claim both royal blood and sacred purpose. The end is presented as a stripping away of privilege and reputation before the earth closes over him. The songs do not ask the listener to pity him. They ask the listener to understand what his actions cost. The last sharp note is a bitter mockery aimed at the invader's heir. It ridicules the hunter's boasts, the wild calls, the trophies brought down from hills and streams, and then twists the knife by reminding the audience where that skill truly showed itself. Not only in battlefields, but in a hall where guests were butchered. The mockery ends with the same vision from the high ground and the same carried head, repeated, like a verdict. It is not subtle. It is meant to seal memory into the listener's mind. After all that, the narrator shifts into a calmer, almost explanatory tone and draws a conclusion that the disaster was tied to a great stone sanctuary and a ceremonial course nearby. The argument is that the site was ancient even then, not built to commemorate the massacre, but selected because its reputation carried weight in a superstitious age. The meeting was chosen precisely because the place was sacred, because serious decisions were expected to be made within consecrated ground, and because the season of early May carried the force of tradition. temporary wooden structures were raised for the gathering, and old rites were performed alongside newer claims of faith. The songs themselves reveal the contradiction. A society calling itself Christian while still burning, with devotion to older sacred figures and older ceremonial habits. The explanation does not excuse the singers who preserved and praised those older rites. It observes, instead, that belief was mixed and imperfect, and that the priests of that world often guarded the old customs with stubborn loyalty. The conclusion is bleak but steady. The catastrophe was not an isolated crime. It exposed a fragile society where ceremony could be turned into a trap, where sacred ground did not prevent betrayal, and where the very institutions meant to restrain violence could be exploited by men who understood the power of ritual and used it to disarm their victims. The final reflections turn outward toward the wider landscape of stone circles and upright pillars found across the land. The suggestion is that such circles functioned as temples, places of worship and assembly, not random monuments. Triangular groups of stones near circles are considered part of the sacred design, sometimes seen as inner sanctuaries or focal points of presence, rather than mere decoration. The lack of carved images is treated as meaningful, not as absence, but as a different habit of representation. Instead of sculpted figures, sacred power may have been attached to raw stones, upright pillars, and simple forms that served as emblems of the divine. The argument does not claim certainty. It offers a plausible way to read the landscape through the lens of the songs. A world where stone and circle, fire and procession, oath and feast carried enormous weight, and where the betrayal of those symbols became one of the most enduring wounds in the memory of an age. In one telling, the poet describes a strange, symbolic life cycle. He imagines himself not as a man at first, but as a single grain linked to an older, flood memory tradition. That grain sprouts on a high place, becomes a stalk, and then forms a full head of corn. Only after reaching that stage does the reaper appear, not to harvest in the ordinary sense, but to take the living ear and hide it away in a tight, smoke-darkened space so it can ripen out of sight. The image is agricultural on the surface, yet it points toward a deliberate, controlled transformation. Something raw is removed from open air, kept under pressure, and shaped until it becomes fit for a new role. Elsewhere, the same process is described more directly. The poet speaks of enduring a strict confinement inside a sacred enclosure associated with a powerful female figure, a place where discipline and instruction are combined. The purpose is not simple punishment, but reformation. The novice is treated as unfinished material, pressed and corrected until he can be presented as complete. Another voice from the same tradition repeats the idea in different words, which strongly suggests that these are not separate stories, but different angles on one ritual sequence. The womb, the hall, and the smoky recess appear to be multiple names for the same experience. Being shut away for an intense period of trial, humility, and private teaching, inside a space considered sacred and identified with the goddess herself. Interpreted this way, the confinement becomes the heart of an initiation drama. The enclosure is not merely a room, it is a symbolic body. The novice enters it as one thing and must emerge as another. The logic matches a pattern known from other ancient mystery traditions, where admission into deeper knowledge is preceded by a staged death, followed by a staged return. Some old Greek formulas even preserve a similar idea through the language of being covered, concealed, and held inside a prepared space before being allowed to step forward into the greater level of the rite. The surface details differ across cultures, but the underlying rhythm is familiar. Concealment, endurance, transformation, then release. A practical question follows naturally from this interpretation. If such confinement mattered so much, where did it take place? One possibility is that some British stone structures, long grouped under a single popular label, were originally built for this purpose. These monuments often consist of upright stones arranged to form a chamber, covered by a huge flat slab. They appear near stone circles and ceremonial grounds, sometimes at the edge of those complexes, sometimes at their very centre. Their age is immense, their original function is mostly forgotten, and that forgetfulness may be the reason later observers began to treat all examples as the same thing. When people see one chamber used for burial, they may assume every similar structure was a grave. When they imagine one as an altar, they may assume the whole class was built for sacrifice. Yet the variety of form and placement suggests multiple functions, not a single explanation. The old arguments have long been divided. Some insisted these chambers were primarily altars for bloody offerings. Others claimed they were nothing but tombs, pointing to bones and urns found beneath a small number of them. But both explanations run into obstacles. Many of these stone tables are slanted or rounded in ways that make them awkward as altars, and they often show no clear traces of burning on their upper surfaces. The burial theory also falters when a number of excavated examples contain no remains, or stand on solid rock where a grave would be difficult to prepare. The more careful conclusion is that similar shapes can serve different roles, and that later discoveries in one place should not be forced onto every site across an entire region. There is another explanation that sits between these extremes and, in some ways, connects them. Initiation often imitates death. A novice may be treated as if he has died to an old identity and is being rebuilt into a new one. In that kind of ritual logic, a chamber that resembles a tomb can serve as a training cell without contradiction. It can represent burial without being a real grave. In older British tales, the candidate is described as passing through a river of death in a small boat, guided like a soul crossing into another realm. But before that stage can be reached, the novice must already have undergone a symbolic burial. The stone chamber, dark and enclosed, could play that role. It is a voluntary test of endurance more than a prison of force, a trial designed to break arrogance, sharpen attention, and mark a boundary between ordinary life and ritual status. Traditional terminology also points in this direction. Some Welsh descriptions treat these stones as part of formal bardic procedure, placed within a circle linked to oaths and collective authority. Certain names connected to these monuments carry the sense of a chest, a coffer, or an ark. That language matters because it aligns neatly with the theme of confinement and rebirth. A stone cover becomes more than a roof. It becomes the lid of a symbolic container. If the initiation culminated in the novice being born again from a sacred enclosure, then a structure imagined as an ark or chest fits the story's inner logic. The chamber is the place where the candidate is hidden, reshaped, and then released. Mythic storytelling reinforces this. In Welsh tradition, a powerful female figure is repeatedly linked to an ark-like presence, and the sanctuary associated with her is portrayed as a living model of that ark. A famous motif describes a huge stone being dragged or rolled from low ground up to the top of a hill by extraordinary strength. Read literally, it sounds like a heroic feat. Read symbolically, it sounds like the transport and installation of a massive capstone, the defining element of a stone chamber. The stone ark becomes not one unique slab, but a general feature of a certain monument type. The image preserves the sense of collective labour and ritual significance, and it also connects the chambers to flood memory, because the ark is the central object in any deluge narrative. When specific monuments are described in detail, they often look less like simple tombs and more like deliberate ritual constructions. One celebrated example is a massive capstone supported by several smaller pillars, arranged so the space beneath forms a chamber. Beneath it lies a well or spring, and local tradition notes a rising and falling of water that seems to respond to the sea. Whatever modern science might say about such behaviour, the symbolic meaning is easy to grasp. A sacred chamber paired with a living water source echoes the idea of renewal and rebirth. Similar cells elsewhere also contain springs, sometimes named in ways that suggest purity or justice. In many ancient mystery settings, water features recur as part of cleansing and symbolic transition, which makes their presence under or beside these chambers feel more intentional than accidental. Other examples sit directly within stone circles. A ring of upright stones encloses a central chamber covered by a giant slab, and the ground beneath is carefully paved, surprisingly neat given the overall roughness of the construction. That kind of arrangement looks like a designed stage, a place intended for repeated use, not a one-time burial. A paved floor makes sense if people entered the space for ritual acts, even if only a few were permitted inside at a time. It also makes sense if the chamber served as a containment space for a novice during a period of darkness and discipline. A tomb does not need a prepared floor in the same way a ceremonial chamber might. Names attached to these sites add another layer. Many are linked to Arthur in later folklore, but that link may not originally refer to a historical war leader at all. In Welsh myth, Arthur can function as a symbolic figure connected to enclosure, survival, and return, themes that naturally attach to arc imagery. Other monuments preserve an even clearer connection to the goddess figure and her pursuit of the novice through animal transformation. In one area, a stone table carries a second name that can be translated as a couch or bed associated with a greyhound. That detail matches old tales in which the goddess takes the form of a hunting animal to drive the novice toward a crucial threshold. Similar place names reappear in multiple counties, suggesting a pattern rather than a coincidence. Springs also carry related names, as if landscape and story had been braided together over centuries. A second mythic mask appears as well. The same goddess is sometimes described as a giantess, old and darkly smiling, and there are enormous capstones locally named as the flat stone of a giantess. Nearby stand other stones counted in meaningful numbers, pillars with titles that imply guidance, and separate stone chests described like beds. The clustering is important. It looks like a complex, not an isolated object. A tomb can stand alone. A ritual landscape tends to gather features around a central place. Chambers, markers, counting stones, and named pillars, all forming an environment where procedure and symbolism can unfold. Place names around some of the largest chambers also preserve strong links to a bardic and druidic world. Surrounding settlements carry titles that translate as Town of Druids, Town of Bards, or Dwellings of Ritual Specialists. Nearby stones are described as belonging to Judgment Hills, suggesting formal assemblies or decisions. In one region, a parish name itself declares Druid Stones, and the primary monuments that justify that name are stone chests covered by great slabs. Local tradition even calls them prisons. That word can sound literal, but in a ritual context it can also reflect the memory of confinement as a test, a stage of initiation rather than a criminal sentence. If a novice entered such a chamber voluntarily and remained there for a time, later generations might remember only that people were shut inside. Even traditions that label some chambers as graves do not necessarily undermine this interpretation. Myth and ritual often overlap with burial language because initiation mimics death. A monument dedicated to a goddess of descent and return can easily become a burial place later, or be reinterpreted as one by communities who no longer practice the older rites. A famous story about a princess linked to the sea and to an underworld lord may preserve, in disguised form, the identity of a goddess figure associated with descent and confinement. When later tellers treat that story as history, the chamber becomes her tomb. When read as myth, it becomes her cell, the place where the ritual drama was staged. Old triads and poems intensify the same theme through lists of legendary prisoners. One figure is described as the sea itself in a mysterious form. Another is linked to lightning and distant northern peoples. And a third is described through a poem that unmistakably echoes deluge imagery. A prison called a deep enclosure, chains of blue, a ruler whose power covers the shores of the world, and a voyage in which only a few return. The language of the prison slides easily into the language of an ark. The first to enter the enclosure reads like the first to enter survival. The captivity becomes the act of being saved inside a container, while the world outside is overwhelmed. Within that mythic frame, the prison has two levels of meaning. In its earliest layer, it is the ark itself, the ultimate chamber of enclosure and survival. In its later, local layer, it becomes the temple and the stone cell that imitates the ark's logic. That would explain why the same words can refer both to cosmic events and to physical places on hillsides. It would also explain why terms associated with wrath and its remission appear as names for the enclosure, the deluge as punishment, the recession of waters as release, the shift from danger to safety enacted as a ritual sequence. Seen through this lens, the stone chambers, their capstones, their springs, their surrounding circles, and their persistent names begin to form a coherent picture. They are not all the same, and they did not all serve one purpose across all time. Some may indeed have become graves. Some may have been repurposed or misread. But a substantial number fit the practical needs and symbolic language of an initiation system built around confinement, endurance, purification, and rebirth. A novice could be placed above ground in a sacred cell, held in darkness and smoke, tested and instructed, and then released as a new person. The old poems preserved the experience as metaphor. Grain ripening in hidden heat, a man reshaped in a sacred hall, a prisoner in an ark-like enclosure, and finally a return that feels like being born again. Some early Welsh poets use a striking word for a sacred enclosure: anoeth. In their verses, it can point to a great ritual precinct, a fair circle, studied and approached with awe. Another poet treats the same idea through paired opposites, describing a deep realm where wrath is absent, and another deep realm where fierce anger remains. In the background sits a simple pattern. One space is imagined as calm, reconciled, and safe, while another is imagined as turbulent, threatening, and full of pressure. The language sounds poetic, but it behaves like a map. It divides the sacred world into zones of danger and zones of release, and it frames initiation as movement between those states. That same symbolic geography appears again in stories of captivity. A figure named Gwer and his descendants are said to remain imprisoned inside this enclosure forever. Taken literally, that claim makes little sense as history. Read as myth, it functions as a statement about identity and legitimacy. The tale suggests that the true family line of the primal survivor is not defined by ordinary birth alone, but by belonging to a ritual community. The descendants are those who have been brought inside the ark-themed mysteries, reshaped by them, and kept within the rules of the order. In that reading, perpetual imprisonment is not a sentence in chains. It is a boundary marker. It means that membership is maintained by strict adherence to the system, generation after generation. Undergoes a confinement that mirrors Gwers, and in a separate poem he appears not as a battlefield hero, but as a presiding figure aboard a sacred ship. The ship is described in the language of marvel and labour, and the voyage ends with almost everyone lost except a small number who return. The imagery is not subtle. It echoes flood survival myths, where the world becomes a sea and salvation is a vessel. In that setting, Arthur becomes another mask for the same ancient survivor, the many-named patriarch who passes through catastrophe and emerges as the anchor of a renewed order. A second confinement is placed beside a powerful female presence, the Lady of the Supreme Leader. Later storytellers turn this into a romantic and adventurous narrative, but the older layer points toward a goddess-like principle tied to generation, motherhood, and renewal. In other words, the episode can be read as a duplicate of the same flood and rebirth theme, or as a separate set of rites linked to a mother figure whose sanctuary serves as a symbolic body. The motif remains consistent: concealment, testing, transformation, and release. The third confinement is even more explicit in its ritual shape. Arthur is said to be held under a flat stone inside a cell connected to a name that also means ark, chest, or mystery. The phrase is important because it points to a physical reality scattered across Britain. Stone chambers tucked under enormous capstones. These flat stones still exist in many places, often near circles and other ceremonial features. The older myth treats such a chamber as the place of emblematic confinement, the stage where privileges are granted and identity is remade. It is the kind of space that could function as a threshold. Entering it marks a death to the old self. Leaving it marks admission to a guarded society. The name attached to that chamber also drifts between meanings. In one line, it appears as the name of the Ark-themed goddess and the Ark itself. In another, it is used as the name of the creature that swallows Jonah in an old religious poem, hinting at a shared image: the belly as a container of trial and rescue. Whether the old British imagination pictured the Ark as a fish, a chest, or a hidden cell is less important than the recurring logic. Salvation is represented as enclosure. Rebirth begins inside a sealed space. A person is remade by being contained. Some copies even replace the chamber's owner with a simpler label: the prison of mystery. That shift is revealing. It suggests that later scribes no longer understood the older names, but they still remembered the function. It was a confinement linked to hidden knowledge. The flat stone above it was not just weight and rock. It was an instrument of admission, the lid over a symbolic boundary. That is why another title for the same stone can be read as the flat stone of shared privilege. The act associated with it was not merely endurance, but incorporation. The candidate who emerged was recognized as part of a regenerate group. One story claims that Arthur is freed from these prisons by a hero named Goru, described as the best, and linked by wordplay to a famous imperial name. Read literally, that detail becomes awkward. A later human rescuer cannot release the ancient survivor from the original ark. But in myth, names often shift into puns, and characters become labels for functions. Best fits the role of the initiator who opens the chamber. The minister of the ark fits the role even better: the ritual specialist who controls entry and exit, and who grants the new status. From this point, the narrative widens. Beyond individual confinements and single poems lies a much bigger question: how did the religion behind these images change over time? And why did it eventually fade? Tracing the rise and transformation of early British ritual systems is tempting, because the surviving material is vivid, strange, and full of echoes. Yet, it is also frustrating. There is no clear timeline, no reliable chronicle written by neutral observers, no orderly record that explains what came first and what came later. What survives is a thick layer of mythic fragments, hints embedded in poetry and symbolic tales, copied long after their original context had begun to disappear. The best that can be done is to sketch patterns from repeated motifs, and to treat those patterns as cultural memory rather than courtroom proof. Even with that limitation, a broad outline emerges. The earliest layer looks like a distortion of an older, simpler faith. Flood survival remembered, then ritualized. A righteous survivor honored, then elevated toward divinity. A vessel of preservation transformed into a sacred model. And a mother figure joined to the story as the genius of the container, the one who governs rebirth. In this layer, the flood narrative is not merely a story about the past. It becomes the framework for identity, authority, and initiation. Over time, another element pushes into the system: star and sun religion, the worship of the heavens, the attraction of bright divine powers linked to cycles, timekeeping, and celestial order. In the British material, that solar figure often appears as a third presence, a younger addition rather than the core. That detail matters because it suggests an innovation. The worship of the patriarch alone, or the arc-focused memory alone, seems older. The blending of the patriarch with the sun seems like a later fusion, a shift from remembrance of survival toward a more cosmic form of worship, and in some stories, that blending is criticized. Reason is portrayed as pushing back against the summer-shine usurper. The tale reads like a moral correction delivered through myth. The bright sky power is an intruder into the older, arc-centered order. A long and complex triad captures this evolution through a deliberately earthy metaphor: mighty swineherds and their herds. It sounds comic to modern ears, but it is not meant as a joke. In many ancient cultures, the pig is linked to earth, fertility, and the power that makes grain grow. In Britain, the mother figure connected to cultivation and rebirth even takes on a sow-like form in myth, addresses her followers with pig names, and is served by boar-like priests. The language is crude only on the surface. Underneath, it is a coded description of roles: the goddess as the source of abundance, the initiates as her herd, and the priesthood as the managers of her sacred stock. The first great swineherd is a figure whose name suggests deep thought and careful consideration. His father's name suggests prudence and reason. Their family line is presented as noble in the old tales, but the names behave like allegory rather than genealogy. The sea, guardian, lofty hillman, fire of the east, and ancient deluge appear in a chain that reads like a mythic formula. It signals that a ritual system arrived through an eastern connection and carried both flood memory and celestial symbolism. The tale does not say it directly in modern terms. Instead, it builds a lineage out of images. That same first system is tied to a coastal region famous in legend for mystery. The land itself is described as veiled, concealed, wrapped in secrecy. It is the kind of place where rites could be imagined as older than ordinary kingship, administered by powers linked to thunder and the deep. In this setting, a story unfolds about a lord of prudence who sets out on a ritual hunt. The chosen ground is literally named as a Valley of the Boat, and the approach runs through a grove associated with a mysterious egg preparation, an image that appears in several ancient mystery systems as a sign of containment and rebirth. The hunt turns strange quickly. Another pack appears with a different voice and a different authority. The dogs are described in a colour pattern traditionally associated with the otherworld. Bright bodies and marked ears, as if dressed in ritual whites with coloured crowns. The Lord drives them off and claims the quarry for his own system. But the master of the other pack arrives and challenges him. This master declares himself ruler of the deep, the ark-themed sovereign. He offers reconciliation, but only on a condition. The intruding Summershine, who harasses his realm, must be defeated. The structure of the bargain is clear. The older deep power claims primacy. The bright sky power is framed as an aggressor. Prudence is invited to take the deep ruler's form for a complete year, presiding over the submerged world as the patriarch once did. Then, to strike down the summer rival in a single blow. The details of the year-long exchange are presented with moral flavour. Silence, restraint, discipline, and self-control. The ruler in disguise is placed in the royal bed and must behave as a person of integrity, even when tested. The result is a return home to a flourishing realm, followed by a permanent alliance with the deep sovereign. This is not just entertainment, it is ritual logic turned into narrative. Initiation as a year of symbolic deluge, ethical testing inside a restricted space, and reintegration with enhanced authority. Then the story shifts to a public seat of power, a raised presidential platform where whoever sits must be wounded or witness a miracle. The Lord sits, and a radiant woman appears on a pale horse, moving slowly along the main road toward the platform. Messengers cannot catch her. Even a rider on a fast horse cannot close the distance. The phenomenon behaves like a rainbow. Visible, steady, seemingly near, yet always beyond reach. The rest of the tale is missing in many transmissions, but the symbolism is still legible. After deluge comes a token of reconciliation. The token is beautiful, unreachable, and meant to be seen rather than seized. That is the first stage, a strongly arc-centered system, occasionally used to criticize solar worship as a later distortion. The second stage is introduced through an even stranger tale. A mystical sow guarded in Cornwall, heavy with young, feared because her offspring are prophesied to bring harm to Britain. A famous champion gathers forces to destroy the sow, but the animal escapes by sea, and the guardian clings to her bristles as she travels. Along the way, she drops gifts and monsters, grains that explain regional fame for wheat, barley, and rye, bees that explain honey, and later, more dangerous creatures that become legendary local threats. A kitten thrown into the sea is rescued, nursed, and grows into a famous menace. It is a wandering myth that reads like nonsense only if taken literally. Read as tradition about religious change, it becomes more coherent. The guardian is not a single man, but the personification of a priestly agency, the managers of a system. The sow is the ark-mother figure, the container of new rites. Her offspring are religious innovations spreading through the landscape. Some bring benefits to cultivation and wealth. Others bring social disruption, conflict, and fear. The journey begins in Cornwall for a reason. Cornwall sits on the edge of sea trade, tied in legend to foreign merchants and distant ritual currents. A system that arrives by ship would be remembered as something that put to sea and came ashore in new places, leaving changes behind. The Triads support this reading by describing three modes of mysticism, three eras or styles of priestly practice. The first is older and more simply arc-centered. The second is linked to a red, bony giant figure and is said to have been taught through Cornwall, suggesting foreign influence and an intensification of star and sun worship alongside flood memory. The third is a blending. the native tradition mixed with imported rites, producing the kind of crowded, hybrid mythology found in later bardic material. In that blended stage, flood survival, mother goddess imagery, celestial worship, and ritual hierarchies are all present at once, no longer neatly separated. Coal can be treated as the key operator behind a later, imported layer of British ritual life. In the traditions that surround him, he is less a single historical man than a symbolic agent for a new package of rites arriving from outside and slowly taking root. That is why the strange tale about his sacred sow matters. Taken literally, it sounds absurd, yet as myth, it behaves like a coded report. A foreign religious system enters by sea, is guarded by specialists, and begins to reproduce itself through converts and local foundations. The animal at the centre of the story is called Henwen, the Old Lady. The title fits an ancient mother figure, an emblem of cultivation and renewal. And in these traditions, the sow is not simply an animal at all. It is a ship. Old Welsh usage could apply sow words to vessels, partly because of shape, partly because the mythic language liked to hide a sacred object behind an earthy image. The Old Lady is therefore best read as a revered craft, a ritual carrier, something that arrives on the coast with a freight that is not ordinary merchandise but symbolic equipment, sacred signs, and the people who know how to use them. That reading also explains why the cargo makes no sense as trade goods. Wolves and eagles are not practical imports, they are religious emblems. The grains mentioned in the tale speak to a cult of seed, storage, and survival, an arc logic, where preservation of life and food is the central image. Even the odd verb that describes the sow laying her offspring, as if producing eggs, becomes clearer once the mother figure is remembered in other Welsh symbols as bird-like as well, capable of taking on the role of a hen in the mythic imagination. The story uses barnyard language to talk about sacred containment and sacred birth. Another detail reinforces the point. The vessel is said to travel by land and sea. That is not a shipping route. It is mythic shorthand for influence spreading across regions, carried by people and institutions. The priest who follows the sow, never letting go, is not a farmer but a ritual specialist, a guide for the cult. The place where the sow begins her journey is also telling. Cornwall, in British memory, is a gateway zone, coastal, trading, exposed to outsiders. The sow is said to belong to blind men and to a master of hidden rites, and she is kept in a veil of mystics. In plain terms, the story frames this system as secretive, foreign, and potentially disruptive to local tradition. That tension is built into the prophecy. Britain will suffer harm from the sow's offspring. In other words, the older religious establishment expects trouble from the new movement once it begins to multiply. The mythic Arthur responds by gathering forces to destroy the sow's line, but the attempt fails. The system survives, spreads, and leaves traces behind. The tale is not describing a chase scene, it is describing a contest between an established native order and a growing imported ritual fashion. The deposits made during the sow's journey can be read as foundations and introductions. The first deposit is wheat and a triad of bees. Wheat clearly signals a cult of grain and blessing. The bees are just as meaningful. In ancient ritual language, they often represent temple attendants, especially female service roles associated with mother goddess sanctuaries. In this reading, the sow's first landing point marks the creation of a new centre, an arc-shaped set of symbols and a small priestly team. The story then repeats the pattern elsewhere with barley and a pig. It is the same idea expressed in different regional colours. A foundation is planted, food symbolism is installed, and the cult replicates itself. Then, The tale becomes darker. A wolf cub and an eagle chick appear next, placed high in the mountains. Both animals function well as solar emblems, predatory, skybound, associated with power and the bright realm above. Their appearance signals that this imported package is not only about survival and seed. It carries a second ingredient: heavenly worship, especially sun-focused symbolism, stitched into the arc-based frame. The blend matters because earlier traditions sometimes criticise sun worship as an intruder. Here, the intruder arrives embedded inside the new cult's toolkit. The mountain site tied to these deposits is described as a formidable city on a high ridge, with multiple walls, many tower bases, and a reliable water source within the innermost enclosure. Its scale and placement suggest something more than a simple fort. An elite centre, a protected complex, a place where secrecy could be maintained and where ritual authority could claim a commanding landscape. Nearby stands a circle and chamber complex associated in older memory with a mother goddess sanctuary. In that neighbourhood, other stories also place dragons, figures closely tied to fiery, solar power in Welsh mythic language. The motif is consistent. High places, enclosed compounds, hidden wells, guarded symbols, and a belief that the fate of the land depends on keeping certain forces properly contained. The final deposit is the strangest: a kitten left under a black stone, then thrown into the Menai, rescued, and later remembered as the Palak cat of Anglesey, a notorious menace. This is not zoology, it is idle language. Cat imagery is widely used in ancient religious symbolism because of its association with night, the moon, and cyclic change. In this British setting, the cat becomes a sign of the same mixed religion, part arc, part heavenly worship, possibly lunar as well as solar. The tale insists that the cat and its foreign-speaking attendants are disturbed and targeted. That hostility fits the larger frame. The older establishment treats these imported emblems as dangerous innovations, and destroying them becomes a virtuous act inside the narrative. With Cole and the old lady set aside, the Triads introduce a third major swineherd, Tristan, better known later through romance as Tristram. Here the symbolism shifts from a cult arriving and multiplying to a native figure negotiating, adopting, and reshaping what has already taken root. Tristan's story is framed as scandalous, adulterous and incestuous. But that moral language is doing mythic work. It signals illegitimate fusion, a crossing of boundaries, a blending of systems that should not have been merged. In this reading, the love affair becomes a metaphor for religious syncretism. Tristan's name marks him as a proclaimer, a herald figure. He is repeatedly positioned as a high-ranking operator in the sacred world, an authorized voice, a ritual leader, someone whose commands cannot be refused without consequences. His associates are similarly symbolic, and the repeated insistence on his authority mirrors what external observers once said about Druidic power in general. He is not presented as a simple lover. He is presented as a moving force inside the religious machinery of a particular era. The herd he guards belongs to a Cornish ruler named March, literally horse. That name is not a random nickname. In many mythic systems, horse is a word that disguises a vessel. The horse of the sea is an old pattern, a transport that carries life through waters of danger. In Britain, the Cornish horse is described not only as a ruler but as a master of ships, reinforcing the idea that the title points toward a sacred craft, an ark-like vehicle, or an ark-themed cult identity. The woman tied to him, Esilt, whose name suggests spectacle or focused sight, carries further symbolism. She is linked to the horse through imagery of a white mane, placing her in the mare tradition that often surrounds mother goddess rites and their priestly attendants. In this setting, the swine that Tristan protects are not animals. They are priests, followers, and sacred assets of the cult. This also explains the unusual episode where Arthur and his companions attempt to seize even a single pig and fail by every method: gift, purchase, trick, force, theft. It is a mythic statement about the resilience of an institution. Neither violence nor persuasion can strip it of its members or its sacred resources. The herds are returned intact to their rightful owners, with their full increase. In other words, the system not only survives pressure, it grows. The Triads preserve many hints that Tristan belongs to a later phase than Kol. Kol appears as the foreign introducer, present before the sow has farrowed on British ground. Tristan appears when the pigs already exist in numbers, still contested, but established enough to require management, negotiation, and protection. Kol is consistently marked as an outsider, bringing a new set of signs. Tristan is native, already prominent, and then becomes entangled with the imported tradition through the figure of a Silt. Later, medieval romance reshapes this mythology into chivalric drama, but traces of the older pattern still show through. Tristan's father becomes the rolling flood in name. His mother becomes a white flower, and his ties to King Mark reflect the older Cornish horse. The mythic flower functions as a token of union and a sign of belonging, like a badge shared by a fraternity. The hero is raised by a figure remembered as a successor who pushes ritual beyond legitimate limits, adopting the child and teaching him an altered law. Even the language of hunting and courtly skills can be read as a mask for initiation training. The inversion of Tristan's name in some versions signals the same idea. He is formed within a system that is close to the old one, but not identical to it. The romance then introduces another strange ship, arriving on the Cornish coast, freighted with hawks. Again, this is not commercial shipping. Hawk imagery is a long-standing sacred symbol in Eastern and Mediterranean cults, and in Britain, the mother goddess tradition can also take hawk-like form. In the romance, Tristan wins these hawks by playing chess and distributes them to allies. Mythically, that looks like dispersal of sacred insignia and the building of networks through gifts and patronage. Soon the hero is recognized by a ring, admitted to rank, and surrounded by attendants bearing boar heads. An unmistakable echo of swineherd symbolism. He then wages conflict against an older authority figure, kills him, and transfers power to the innovating patron who raised him. In Triad language, the successor replaces the previous ruler. In myth language, a newer ritual order displaces an older one. Then comes the most famous sequence. The hero is wounded with poison, becomes socially intolerable, and entrusts himself to the sea in a drifting ship. This is a classic renewal motif. The damaged initiate is removed from ordinary life, carried by a vessel, and restored through the skill of a powerful woman and her court. Once healed, he becomes instructor to a princess, Esilt in another form, teaching music, poetry, and elite knowledge. It reads like training within a sanctuary. The return to Cornwall triggers the political marriage plot, but the decisive engine of the myth is the potion. A queen prepares a powerful drink meant to secure harmony between bride and groom. Through accident and fatigue at sea, the drink is consumed by Tristan and the princess instead, binding them in a sudden, irresistible passion. Even a dog that licks the cup becomes inseparable from them. In symbolic terms, the potion functions like an initiation draft, a sacred mixture that changes status, bonds participants, and creates an irreversible connection. In Welsh tradition, the cauldron and the drink are central images for admission, transformation, and the receiving of benefits from the rite. Romance turns it into a love-tragedy mechanism, but the older logic still pulses beneath the surface. A consecrated drink creates a new condition that ordinary law cannot easily undo. Finally, the figure who carries the drink and oversees the princess appears as a shadow of a British underworld bride, an attendant figure tied to Ireland and to a cauldron-bearing tradition in older myth. Romance names her differently, but the structure remains. A woman associated with a sacred vessel mediates the transition, and her action, intended for lawful union, produces instead an illicit bond mirroring the larger theme of mixed and contested religious systems. All of this can be narrated as a documentary-style interpretation without claiming certainty where the sources are symbolic. The safest conclusion is also the most consistent with the material. These stories preserve cultural memory of competing ritual programs, an older, arc-centered tradition, a foreign-influenced package that blended arc symbolism with solar and possibly lunar emblems, and later, hybrids that spread through Cornwall into Wales and beyond. The animals, the ships, the grains, the towers, the potions and the scandals are not random fantasies. They are the dramatic clothing of an argument about origins, authority, contamination, and survival. In the later retellings, even the smallest details are treated like signals. A name such as Gododdin is not handled as a random character label, but as a coded marker. It is linked to ripening grain and the ear of corn, an attribute often tied to the old agricultural mother figure. In that symbolic language, a person described as a dog can still represent a temple attendant, because priestly groups in several ancient traditions were imagined as hounds, and Welsh stories repeatedly picture ritual personnel as white dogs, moving under a supernatural command. So the faithful dog who follows the lovers is read as a figure for a devoted minister within a serial-centered mystery cult, dressed in animal imagery to conceal the religious meaning. Once the romance shifts into motion, the story starts behaving like a map of transmission. Isolde becomes queen, and soon an Irish admirer arrives disguised as a minstrel, steals her away, and carries her off by ship. On the surface, it reads like court drama. Underneath, it can be understood as an initiation route. The minstrel disguise fits the idea of a ritual specialist moving between courts, and the ship becomes the vehicle by which a set of rites travels from Cornwall to Ireland. The narrative then reverses the abduction. Tristram recovers Isolde and returns her to the king, while maintaining a secret private link to her. That double structure, public restoration, private continuation, mirrors the way an official cult might condemn a practice while private circles keep it alive. One of the most striking secret link episodes uses floating pieces of wood inscribed with hidden signs. In a documentary reading, this is not romance decoration. It is an allusion to divination by lots. Marked sticks, cut from a fruit-bearing tree, used to consult the gods and communicate decisions through coded symbols. The scene is staged in an orchard, which can be taken in two overlapping ways. It can be a literal grove where sacred trees are kept and ritual materials are cut. Or it can be a metaphor for the whole symbolic system, a managed landscape of signs. In Northern tradition, an entire circle of mysteries is even described as a vast orchard of matching trees, equal in age, size, and form, suggesting a disciplined, standardized body of sacred tallies, each one a piece of the same hidden grammar. After this, Tristram is promoted into a role that looks like a high ritual office. The keeper of hidden knowledge, granted access that would normally be forbidden. The romance expresses that privilege through sleeping quarters near the queen, then turns the arrangement into scandal, exile, and wandering. When the hero arrives in Wales and defends a ruler against a giant, the pattern repeats: political adventure on the surface, religious competition underneath. In many mythic frameworks, a giant often stands for an impious rival mode, a heterodox priesthood, or a cult imagined as brutal. Killing such a figure in single combat becomes a symbolic victory over a practice judged unacceptable by one faction. The Welsh episode adds another detail that looks decorative until it is read as emblematic. A small dog, spotted with red, blue, and green, is given as a gift and then sent onward to Isonde. In this interpretation, the dog again represents a minister or initiate, and the three colours function like visible ranks, tokens worn by different orders, with blended colours suggesting a person trained across multiple grades. The romance converts coloured insignia into a living mascot because that is what myth does. It gives an institution a body and a face. The lovers' retreat into the forest pushes the symbolism further. A forest in these narratives often behaves like a sacred grove, and the cave they find, said to have been made by giants, resembles a consecrated chamber built by an earlier, rival system. The lovers survive there by venison brought by dogs. That can be read as priestly attendants, bringing in novices, with the deer standing for candidates who are hunted, tested, and symbolically taken. When the king discovers the pair sleeping with a drawn sword placed between them, the romance explains it as proof of innocence. In ritual terms, the sword can be understood as the boundary marker of discipline, the weapon drawn against transgression and then formally sheathed again in solemn assembly, a symbol used to show control rather than violence. The later Brittany sequence extends the same logic across the channel. The Cornish hero enters the service of a Breton lord and marries another Isonde, presented as more proper, more restrained, and less entangled in scandal. The marriage is loveless because the hero's ring, his remembered sign of an older bond, pulls him back to the Cornish queen. In a neutral documentary voice, this can be framed as the encounter between two ritual climates, a simpler local tradition and a more sensational, worked-up version imported from Cornwall. The Breton version does not satisfy the Cornish specialist because it lacks the particular features that made the Cornish system powerful, theatrical, and socially dangerous. That difference becomes sharper in the episode involving a fearsome neighbouring giant named Baliagog. The Breton lord warns the hero not to hunt on the giant's lands. The hero ignores the warning, hunts there, defeats the giant, and makes him a subordinate. Read symbolically, the giant here can stand for a solar cult, Beli as a sun title, a bright power that some groups considered a late corruption. The romance is consistent with a larger pattern found in British myth. Whenever corruption is described, some solar reference tends to appear close by, either through a name, an emblem, or an act of forbidden ritual, hunting. Then the tale delivers one of its most revealing images. The subdued giant is ordered to build a hall in honour of two female figures tied to Cornish mystery tradition, and the hall is built inside the giant's own fortress, with a secret approach known only to the Cornish hero. In a documentary adaptation, this can be described as the establishment of a shrine within the stronghold of the solar power, a deliberate fusion of two currents, arc-centered symbolism and heavenly worship, arranged so that access is controlled and hidden. The hall is decorated with sculptures showing the hero's entire previous life, including the central court figures and the dogs. If the scene is treated as mythic memory rather than literal architecture, it describes a full doctrinal tablet, a visual program that records the rites, the hierarchy, the key actors, and the ritual assistants. Essentially, a portable religion turned into a carved narrative. At this point, the the story begins to resemble a tradition about export and study. The Breton prince, overwhelmed by the images, faints. Once recovered, he becomes obsessed with meeting one of the female attendants and sails to Cornwall under the guidance of the British ritual expert. The voyage ends in marriage within the forest grove setting. Through this lens, the romance describes a movement of initiation from Britain into Gaul and back again, with Cornwall acting as the main hub, an idea that matches older claims that those seeking deeper instruction travel to Britain to learn. Even so, the romance itself is not presented as history. It is better handled as a dim lantern in a dark corridor, unreliable in detail, valuable in pattern. When the episodes are laid beside triadic summaries and older Welsh mythic structures, a coherent outline emerges. First comes an early arc-centred religious memory that resists star and sun worship as an intrusion. Then comes a Cornish introduced system that keeps the arc framework but blends it with celestial devotion, especially solar symbols. Finally comes a hybrid phase, represented through Tristan/Tristram, that spreads widely, reaches Ireland, concentrates in Cornwall, and leaves enough of an imprint to be recast into medieval European romance. The narrative then turns northward and forward in time, toward pressure, suppression, and survival under new political conditions. Official power is portrayed as hostile. Pagan rites are restricted. Groves and altars are targeted, and public sacrifice becomes harder to perform openly. Yet older custom rarely disappears overnight. Remote districts, language barriers, and semi-autonomous local rule provide shelter for private ritual life. In that sheltered space, poems are memorized, symbols are preserved, and less visible ceremonies continue. From scattered northern traditions, an even sharper claim appears. A northern centre of pagan training persisted beyond the reach of immediate control. In this view, a druidic establishment somewhere in the far north or in an offshore refuge continued its discipline for generations. Some stories imply that it retained brutal elements, including rites imagined as human sacrifice. The symbolism used to hint at this is vivid. Dark birds guarding treasure, wearing a golden yoke and consuming people daily. Whether or not this reflects literal practice, within the mythic code it signals a cult associated with predation, tribute, and fear, marked by solar emblems such as the eagle. The leader attached to these birds is remembered as Gwendolen. The texts treat him in two ways at once, as a northern ruler and as a title that looks like a solar epithet. His family connections are presented in a vocabulary of sea, enclosure, preservation, light, mist, memory, precisely the sort of naming system that myth uses to declare divine or semi-divine identity. Poems attributed to a northern seer describe him collecting offerings from the ends of the land, then being covered by red turf, a death image that reads like the fall of a major sacred authority. That northern seer is Myrddin, depicted not as a wandering poet in the modern sense, but as a high-status judge, ritual specialist, and prophet. In these materials, bard points to office, not hobby. A role tied to law, divination, and the custody of sacred knowledge. Myrddin's world is filled with signs, books of inspiration, visions, and the language of hidden rites. His genuine northern idiom is sometimes detectable beneath later political prophecy that others added afterward. In one key poem, he appears again as a swineherd, another coded title for a mystagogue, living in a remote waterbound refuge, practicing divination by seabirds, until persecution forces flight. The persecution is led by a Christian champion figure associated with the Strathclyde region, a king remembered as generous but relentless toward pagan practice. In the mythic retelling, the swine are warned to burrow into secret places in the forest and avoid the hunters of the watery dwellings, language that becomes coherent if the swine are read as initiates and the watery dwellings as their insular or coastal refuges. Another short dialogue dramatizes the pressure to accept baptism. A visiting scholar threatens royal vengeance on those who refuse to enter the water. The scene frames conversion as a demand enforced by authority rather than a quiet persuasion, and it portrays the old priest as defiant, destructive toward churches and schools, yet finally frightened into pleading for forgiveness. The same pressure is also hinted at through the famous Battle of Eagles, dated in tradition to the late 6th century. In a documentary adaptation, it can be presented not as a single sword clash, but as a campaign of suppression. Edicts, sermons, demolition of idols, punishment of resistors, expulsion, and forced public rituals of conversion. The eagle imagery, the cannibal human dog, and the collapsing pagan strongholds become part of a symbolic language used to describe the dismantling of a northern sacred hierarchy. The sea crossings described in these old traditions are placed in a narrow window of time, after Roman authority faded in the 5th century, but before the broad Christian shift across Wales was firmly settled toward the end of the 6th. In that gap, the stories imagine something more than travel. They picture a deliberate return movement, ritual objects, trained specialists, and a complete ceremonial household being carried back from the north into Welsh territory. Even the name given to the leader of the first group hints at the kind of religion being carried, because it sounds like a title that points toward the sun, and solar symbolism has already been tied, elsewhere in the cycle, to the Cornish ritual innovators. The second load in the triadic sequence is introduced with the image of a horse marked by small crescent horns. The detail matters because a crescent, in this storytelling language, often works like a passport or badge. A simple object can stand in for a vessel, a ceremony, or an authority recognized at night gatherings. The horse itself behaves like a ship, and the crescent becomes the sign that opens doors, the token that grants entry to secret celebrations. The travellers carried by this crescent-bearing craft are not random heroes dropped into the list for colour. They appear as relatives, allies, or members of a northern cult circle, tied by pedigree and association to the same northern power centre. In that group, certain names return again and again in the northern material. Some are linked to sea ancestry, to brilliance, to preservation, to a family line that reads like a mythic genealogy, rather than a normal royal house. The tale also includes figures whose reputations turn dark. One of them is described in later tradition as a human dog, a monstrous being who delights in offerings of people. That should not be read too quickly as a literal creature. It signals a sacrificial reputation, the sort of rumour that grows around a rival priesthood or a grim cult image. The story then insists that such a figure is ultimately killed by a leader associated with learning and reform. A pattern that repeats whenever the old system is shown collapsing under new religious pressure. A third load is attached to another seahorse, and here the text plays with language that points toward bees and swarms. In this symbolic world, the bee is not a naturalist detail. It is a religious emblem closely connected with temple service, with guarded sanctuaries, and with a female presence in the mystery tradition. The ship is not described as transporting everyday goods. It transports a ritual network, a moving shrine, a travelling household of meaning. The leader connected to this craft is shown as master of a sacred bull, a creature treated as demonic in one line, yet tied to an ark-centred divinity in another. That contradiction is typical of these sources. One group's holy symbol becomes another group's horror story. The place associated with this bull and its priest is drawn as a northern headland or island mount, a refuge beyond easy reach, a seat of authority in the far regions. In the story, it functions as a major temple castle within the imagined realm of the great mythic king. Much later, when Christian power becomes dominant, the same kind of site is said to become a church centre. That shift fits a familiar historical pattern. New sacred buildings rising where older sacred ground once stood. Not because the old place was forgotten, but because it was too significant to leave empty. The northern stronghold is linked to a name that appears in poems about a seer living near a fort of the wheel and a ford of the wheel, a landscape of ritual geography rather than ordinary travel notes. The story then makes a bold suggestion. The hidden northern seminary may have been an island sanctuary that later became famous for Christian learning. The reasoning is simple in its own terms. The island is tied to a short, powerful name associated with the old patriarch figure, and another major island sanctuary in Wales is explicitly called the Island of Praise for that same figure. In other words, the names themselves are treated as fossils, preserving the memory of what the place once meant before it changed owners. From that northern refuge, the sons of the northern priest king are imagined sailing south. Their stated purpose is revenge, but the symbolic meaning can be framed differently. A return attempt, a reassertion of honour, a replanting of rites that had been weakened under imperial oversight. Among the names listed in the expedition is one that functions like a title for the flood patriarch, the same figure who appears throughout the older mythic system. The implication is that the journey is not only political, it is also doctrinal. The returning group confronts a quieter, diminished form of the old religion that had survived in the south, and by force of energy and confidence, they restore part of the northern programme in Welsh territory during a brief moment of independence. This sets the stage for the later crisis. The collapse of the northern cult is remembered under the name of a famous battle, but the battle reads like a compressed symbol for an entire campaign. Edicts, raids on sacred places, public humiliation, punishments, and forced conversions. A poem attributed to a northern seer, treated as genuine by some scholars, is presented as the voice of a defeated priesthood. It speaks in images that can be taken as the last language of a closed order. In the aftermath, the seer's personal grief is made heavier by a tragic mistake during the conflict, described as the killing of a close family heir. The incident is too poetic and too uncertain to pin down as a literal event. It works better as a moral marker. It suggests that, in defending the old fraternity, the seer committed an act that damaged the cause from within, an error that brought shame and weakened the already collapsing resistance. After this, the story says his mind broke, his social life ended, and he fled into the deep forest. Yet the poem that follows does not sound like true disorder. It sounds controlled, coded, and deliberate. It reads like a prophet's disguise, a performed madness that discourages questions, while the hidden structure carries messages to those trained to hear them. The poem's surface claim is simple. A lord once showed the seer an orchard of 147 perfect apple trees, all identical, all precious, and the seer carries the orchard's gift in memory through every wandering. That image cannot be literal. The orchard is too exact, too portable, too obviously constructed as a symbol. The number is one of the clues. In this tradition, certain numbers carry weight, and 147 is treated as a sacred count. The orchard is said to have been revealed at dawn, the moment when night rites end and initiates emerge from secrecy. The trees are identical in every measure, as if they are tallies, rather than living plants. That points toward a specific practice: divination by marked pieces of wood, lots cut from a fruit-bearing tree, thrown under a covering cloth and read as messages from the unseen. In that reading, the orchard becomes a complete library of omen sticks, a system of sacred signs disguised as a grove. The poem then turns one tree into a stand-in for all the rest. The blossoms are described as pure white, the branches wide, the fruit sweet but difficult to digest. The image suits a priesthood that prides itself on white clothing, wide authority and doctrine meant only for trained minds. The tree is said to have grown in a wood set apart, a grove kept away from common gaze. A female figure, described as appearing and vanishing, speaks prophecies from within the orchard's shelter. The guardian is not named as a human woman in the way a court romance would name one. She is the ritual mistress of the place, the presence that protects the secrets and delivers the words that come to pass. As the stanzas continue, the seer claims to guard the trunk with sword and shield in the Caledonian forest, as if defending a physical tree from attackers. But the true object is knowledge. The small shoots are not for eating. They are for reading. They are the sprigs from which lots are cut, the pieces on which signs are carved, the materials that can become both message and weapon. The poem hints that the guardian figure addresses him as a little pig, an insult on the surface, but a title inside the older code. The swineherd is the keeper of initiates, and the swine are the initiated group that must hide when hunters arrive. Then, the poem introduces enemies. It warns against dark-clad intruders climbing the branches. The imagery fits a cultural clash: black-robed religious agents trying to expose the grove's secrets, while the old priest vows to defend them. In this section, the seer speaks like a man whose world is shrinking. Former allies no longer greet him. His complexion is faded by mourning. Familiar faces vanish, replaced by strangers who do not recognize him. The tree is loaded with fruit, yet it becomes a source of fear because the woodmen might dig up the root and corrupt the seed so that no apples ever grow again. In plain language, the Order fears total eradication, the destruction of their materials, their sanctuaries, and their line of transmission. The poem continues to paint the pressure in social terms. Princes are accused of inventing pretexts, assisted by gluttonous and dishonest clerics and bold young agents who rush to destroy what they do not understand. Sacred circles are trampled. Raised rings and stone assemblies are flattened. The grove that avoids rumour is forced into the open. The priest's language makes his goal clear. Keep the orchard hidden, keep the signs intact, keep the knowledge from becoming common property. Even the metaphors emphasize resistance. The tree would rather be unseen than displayed. Attempts to make it public are compared to water trying to soak a duck's feather, a futile effort against something built to resist. Despite despair, the poem also clings to hope. It imagines future restoration, a time when the old sanctuary will regain strength and the bard will receive his due. It speaks of long endurance measured in centuries, as if the tradition has already survived one long era of restraint and expects it may survive another. Yet the present feels bleak. The tree is surrounded more often by a violating wolf than by a youth able to enjoy its fruit. The line can be heard as the priest lamenting that persecution is more common than apprenticeship, that predators outnumber students. As the stanzas grow sharper, the poem names its persecutor more directly: a regional ruler presented as enemy of the bardic community. The seer complains that the grove has no skilled protector against this ruler's chiefs. The roots are trampled while crowds gather. He speaks of having ruined a son and daughter of authority, a confession that suggests bitter conflict and dangerous acts. He begs for death, and refuses consolation. He remembers wearing a gold collar in the days of honour, a symbol of rank. He longs to stand again among the white-robed ones. In the background is the fall of his lord and the destruction of the northern centre. The poem also reveals something uncomfortable about the defeated order. One prophecy is described as coming from the guardian presence itself, and it places victory in the mouth of a child of the sun, bold in his courses. Saxons are described as being driven out, and bards flourishing again. Whatever the exact historical meaning, the symbolism is plain. The old system is not purely arc-centred in this late phase. Solar language has entered the heart of its self-image. The seer's order imagines renewal through a figure carrying sun authority, even while earlier layers of the tradition treated solar cult as corruption. Later stanzas add more coded promises. Conferences at named fords, the arrival of eagles from across the sea, the division of long-haired ranks into gentle and fierce, the return of justice and reward. The language is intentionally hazy, filled with animals and titles that can be read in more than one way. That haze is not accidental. It is a security measure. The poem repeatedly insists that the fruit is not for the multitude. The sweet fruits are prisoners of words, locked inside code, carried by trained mouths rather than public pages. Even if the orchard image can stand for Druidism as a whole, a closer reading points to something narrower and more practical. A specific technique of divination built around marked pieces of wood. The repeated pattern is hard to ignore. The moment the hidden trees are contemplated, a prediction follows. Sometimes the seer speaks it directly. Other times it is placed in the mouth of the elusive guardian figure who appears and vanishes like a ritual presence. That rhythm suggests the trees are not simply a poetic ornament. They function like instruments. In the language of the old tradition, they align most naturally with omen sticks, lots, or lettered tallies used to draw messages from chants and pattern. Because Myrddin was treated by later generations as the last great northern prophet, his authority became almost untouchable. His voice did not fade as fashions changed. It was kept alive for centuries, repeated, reshaped, and preserved as a kind of sacred inheritance. And when political pressure demanded fresh predictions, later, poets often chose the easiest solution. Instead of inventing a new prophet, they expanded the old one. They inserted new lines into older poems, or they made it seem as if the dead seer was still speaking from beyond the grave. In that way, the name stayed the same even when the message shifted. The power of the brand mattered as much as the content. To a modern ear, these prophecies rarely sound impressive. Their confidence can feel unearned, their images exaggerated, their certainty disconnected from reality. But that weakness is not unique to a single culture. Many societies have elevated seers, treated private guesses as public guidance, and given sacred weight to predictions that later proved hollow. Some of the most famous ancient oracles became targets for revision precisely because people believed them. When a prophecy carries authority, rewriting it becomes tempting and dangerous. A polished prediction can justify an invasion, stir panic, or provide moral cover for ambitions that would otherwise look like naked aggression. That is why certain communities punished the tampering itself. Altering sacred predictions was not merely a literary crime, it was a political weapon. After the poems attributed to Myrddin fall silent, the narrative itself changes. Northern Druidism fades from view. The remaining traces become scattered hints, regional memories, and later legends rather than a living public system. The focus moves southward toward Wales and the shifting boundary between older customs and new religious authority. What survives is not a neat record, but a patchwork of claims, symbols, and reworked traditions that still carry the shape of an earlier world. From that point, the story turns into a closing assessment. It frames the bardic claim plainly. The bards insisted they preserved the secret knowledge of the Druids, and when their writings are set beside outside testimony, there are enough overlaps in themes, practices, and symbolic habits to suggest that the claim is not pure invention. The material is tangled and often obscure, but it does not float free of history. It repeatedly touches the same fixed points. When attention shifts from speculative philosophy to rites and belief, a broad structure emerges. The old British system is described as two interwoven strands. One strand centres on flood memory. It preserves a story of destruction and survival, then turns that survival into sacred drama, a preserved family, a vessel that carried them, and a continuing reverence for the figures connected to that rescue. The second strand centres on the sky. Sun and moon and the host of heaven become objects of ritual attention, sometimes as symbols, sometimes as powers in their own right. What makes the British case notable in these traditions is not uniqueness, but mixture. Similar pairings appear across much of the ancient world, where flood remembrance and sky worship often travel together, braided into one religious fabric. The material also draws a distinction between what is presented as original and what is treated as later intrusion. Flood remembrance appears everywhere in the deep layers of the tradition. In origin, stories, in national beginnings, in the way the landscape is explained. That constant presence is used to argue that the earliest settlers carried a corrupted form of an older, patriarchal religion, one that had already drifted into symbolic worship. In contrast, the worship of sun and moon is repeatedly described as a disruptive addition, arriving through specific regions and spreading outward. Cornwall becomes the key doorway in the narrative, a coastal hinge where foreign contact is imagined to deliver new ritual habits. The tale frames this sky-centered element as an alloy mixed into an older base, not the base itself. Seen from that angle, the religion described here does not stand apart as a separate species. It looks like a local variation of a wider, ancient pattern. Flood-centered myth and sky-centered devotion appear in many places, often bound together, often feeding off each other. The interesting question is why those two strands fuse so easily. What links a rescued family and a salvific vessel with the glowing bodies that cross the sky? Why does a preserved patriarch become entangled with solar imagery? Why does a mother figure become tied to lunar symbolism? Those questions cannot be settled here, but the pattern itself invites a plausible sequence. In the earliest stage, the survivors of a catastrophic flood would naturally be treated with reverence by their descendants. While alive, their counsel would carry weight. Their memory would be guarded. Over time, reverence can slide into invocation, and invocation can slide into worship. A family remembered as miraculously spared can be recast as a family of mediators between humanity and the highest power. The vessel that carried them can shift from memorial to talisman. A symbol once used to recall survival can be treated as a pledge of future safety. Once that happens, imagination supplies the rest. The vessel gains a guardian, the guardian becomes a universal mother, and the entire story turns into a drama that can be performed, repeated, and expanded. Then astronomy enters as an amplifier. Early post-flood sky observation may have begun as a commemorative tool, a way of fixing memory into the stars, arranging signs and constellations as a moving calendar of survival. At first, such a system could be innocent, even meaningful. But once the heavens become a vast painted record, the temptation grows. If the stars carry the story, then the wandering lights might be treated as living emblems. If the sun and moon travel through the houses of the immortals, the mind begins to treat sun and moon as signs of those immortals, then as mediators, then as powers worthy of ritual attention. In this way, the flood story and sky worship can merge until they are no longer separable. The ark becomes a cosmic pattern. The patriarch becomes a celestial force. The old memorial becomes a full theology. Even within these traditions, that merger is not presented as the very first stage. Many myths speak of resistance, reluctance, and conflict around the adoption of sky-centered worship. New gods are admitted late. New rites are argued over. The stories themselves preserve the sense that something changed, and that the change was not universally welcomed. The British material follows that same logic. It keeps pointing back to an older baseline, and it labels the solar and lunar focus as an innovation that arrived with contact and trade. At the same time, the tradition does not pretend that the older strand was pure. It admits that the patriarch figure was treated as divine and that symbolic worship grew heavy and literal. Yet it also preserves fragments of a different awareness. The flood survivor is sometimes described as righteous rather than cosmic. The story implies a rescue by a higher power rather than rescue by the survivor's own divinity. The same body of material can speak in two voices. One voice turns the survivor into a god. Another voice hints that the survivor was a human being preserved by the will of a supreme ruler. From this tension comes a wider judgment about what paganism looks like from the inside. The problem is not always ignorance of a first cause. Many ancient systems still speak of a highest power, of providence, of moral responsibility. The rupture happens when the highest power's place is given away to something else. When symbols take the throne. When creatures become the focus that should belong to the creator. The old British system, in this reading, is portrayed as a mind divided against itself. It can still recognize a supreme ruler in moments of honesty, yet it continues to build ceremonies that honor lesser images as if they were ultimate. That recognition also leads to another observation. When a religion is a corruption of an older one, it may still preserve genuine fragments of its source. A system can drift, deform, and misapply, while still carrying intact pieces of earlier belief. That means it is risky to assume that every sacrifice, every purification, every sacred emblem found among ancient peoples must be a pure invention. Some rites may be survivals, altered in meaning but rooted in older practice. A corrupted channel can still carry clear water in places, even if much of what flows through it has been tainted. This point matters when critics try to dismiss ancient scriptures by arguing that certain rituals or symbols resemble those found in Egypt, Syria, or Mesopotamia. Resemblance alone does not prove borrowing in the late direction. If early revelation existed in the remote past, and if many peoples carried broken remnants of it, then parallels become expected. A renewed revelation could repeat older symbols, not because they are pagan, but because they are ancient and foundational. In that view, shared motifs across cultures can be read as evidence of a common deep memory, rather than a one-way act of plagiarism. Finally, the flood theme itself is treated as more than folklore. It is presented as a worldwide imprint, pressed into mythologies far beyond one land. The argument implied by this kind of material is simple. When many distant traditions, each distorted in its own way, still converge on a story of overwhelming waters, a preserved righteous figure and a saving vessel, the convergence deserves attention. Even when later ages transform the survivor into a god or attach the story to the sun and moon, the core claim remains. A catastrophe happened, and a small group was preserved. Across these traditions, the survivor is repeatedly marked as different from the perishing crowd, not by strength, but by a moral or sacred distinction.